I always called Yelp pragmatic Google. Like that was what I was always trying to make, which was like Google had a lot of beautiful things. I always felt at Google 20% of the engineering team was being utilized. And there was this 80% that just was languishing.
I'm Stan Christensen, and this is All Things Negotiation. Today, my guest is Michael Stoppelman. Michael started his career at Google in the pre-IPO days as part of the engineering team. And there were only a couple hundred engineers when he joined. When he left in 2007, there were over 5,000 engineers. He left and went to Yelp, which at the time only had 6 engineers, and he grew that team to over 500 engineers over a decade. We'll talk about the role of negotiation in both hiring and managing engineers, and the role of negotiation between engineering and product management. We'll wrap up by talking a bit about Michael's career post-Yelp as an angel investor, where he's made over 300 investments, and we'll hear about some of the advice he gives entrepreneurs in that journey. Michael Stoppelman, welcome to the podcast.
Super excited to be here.
Yeah, I've been excited for the conversation because you are a unique person, and you've been in a large engineering team, a medium growing engineering team, and now you advise early stage startups and do a lot of work with their engineering teams. So we're going to cover all of those. And today on the podcast, we're going to talk about the role of negotiation for engineers. I'd love just to start at Google. I think that was maybe an early job for you. You were there in the 2003 to 2007 timeframe. What was the environment on the engineering team? Just give us a sense of how many people, how did you guys work with each other? Anything that would be useful for listeners.
Yeah, so when I joined Google, I actually joined in post-sales support. So I was in building Pi, and the entire company at the time when I joined was 1,000 people. And so in that first year, I moved from post-sales support to engineering. I worked the night shift, so Google didn't have any other offices. So there was no Google office in London, which was the first office that they opened up. And so I got asked to move to that London office in my first year, and I said no, because I wanted to be as close to the Googleplex and Larry and Sergey's office as I could so that I could get into engineering. Over that year, I architected my move from post-sales support to engineering without an interview. Like my goal is to not have an interview for the engineering role, because at that time they were only accepting ACM champions. And this is like the smartest of the smartest engineers were only getting in. And I knew I was like decent, but not that good. Right. And so it was like mostly gold medalists of different types of mathematical championships and mathematical Olympiads that were in engineering at the time. So I was like, okay, I need to figure this out. So anyways, over the year, I got into engineering. I built the original tools for the ad spam team. That was the click fraud team that was now known as traffic quality. And so I built the original tools for the traffic quality team, and then got sucked into engineering through a chain of Gokul Ramajan, Gokul, who's now a famous angel investor, and Wesley Chan, who is my first product manager, who's also a famous VC now. And then Greg Bodros was also part of that chain that led me into engineering. So it was very
early
cool.
days. Yep. So you negotiated your way into an engineering job without being interviewed. I'm guessing you're the only person that succeeded at that. So well done. So now you're in the team. What was the management within the team like at Google at that point? How did engineers get managed, or did they get managed?
Yeah, it was a very interesting time at Google. I've never gotten the exact history of like what happened, but when I was at Google, the predominant view was that engineers didn't need management, and that Larry had decided that engineering managers are not useful, and it only gets in the way of priorities. So you were largely left as an engineer to figure out what the highest priority thing was, and to go figure out how to add value to that thing. And at the time, this was kind of pre-IPO Google, and so everyone had options, and they all saw the crazy growth that Google was under. And so I think that there was an energy of like, hey, we're on this rocket ship. Go figure out what different teams need help, and go make the rocket ship work. And so that was kind of the the energy that I got. And I think that lasted for a while until it got unwieldy.
Yeah, Paul Graham has recently written an essay, and I'll post this on the website, called Founder Mode. And essentially, one of the things he says there is traditionally the idea of just hire good people and let them get stuff done that works in the early stage of a company doesn't work so well as you grow the company. It sounds like that characterized your days at Google. Did you feel like it worked well? And if so, why? Because that doesn't scale forever.
Yeah, I think that is true when you end up in a company that has very diverse, many different angles of business attack. I think if you have like a unified goal of like one thing that you're trying to get after, and the company that's coming to mind is SpaceX. So it's like, hey, we have a goal of getting to Mars. Everyone get attached to that goal. We're going to go to Mars, and like everything in the company kind of coalesces around that. I think when you have missions, like a mission-driven company where it has like one or two or three different threads, but like when you think about a company like Airbnb, where it has like, okay, we have a landing page for Germany with an FAQ for German hosts, and we need someone to work on that. It's like, how do you get the engineer motivated to like work on that part of the website when the core of Airbnb is the hosting experience? So I think when you have a company where it has like one or two or three clear goals of like, we're getting to Mars, you need to work on this Starship, and we need the Starship engine to work. It's very easy for an engineer to connect that goal to getting to Mars. It's very hard for an engineer to go, okay, I'm working on this FAQ part of the website in German for German hosts, and that's going to like somehow like, it's just not as visual and not as exciting as like the Starship kind of visual for me as an engineer, right? And so I think that those two types of managing companies require different things. I always called Yelp pragmatic Google. Like that was what I was always trying to make, which was like Google had a lot of beautiful things. Google's ability to attract talent was amazing, but at Yelp, I wanted to be a pragmatic version of that, because it was just like, I always felt at Google 20% of the engineering team was being utilized, and there was this 80% that just was languishing, right?
Interesting. Well, let's transition to Yelp, because at Yelp you had the chance to build your own team the way you wanted to. Your brother was one of the co-founders and the CEO. Talk a little bit about that decision to join, just briefly, and whether that was seen as sort of a positive or something to manage, because you're going to essentially be working for your brother.
Yeah. So the decision to join Yelp happened over a trip that my brother and I took to Argentina. We were there for 10 days together, and then by, every kind of different moment, like the question would be asked, hey, will you interview at Yelp? Like, you should come join the team. And at the time I was at Google, and I was vesting my Google shares, and at that time, that was a very large sum of money. It was like, that was a life-changing amount of money for a 22-year-old, 23-year-old to have. And so I was like, hey, it's great. But at that time, Yelp was about, it was right around like 30 or 40 employees. And Yelp had actually had an attempt for someone to buy it. And so that was like the first sign that like things were really gelling with Yelp. And I have this very engineering spirit. I like utility-based products, and the search results for San Francisco for what's called pizza were so good compared to a Google result that I really understood what Yelp was doing and why it was different than what Google was doing, right? Google was crawling the web and indexing the world's information. Yelp was convincing people to write reviews for content that didn't exist. The only place that existed was in people's brains. And the amazing part of Yelp was that it was convincing people to actually write that content down on the web. And that was the innovation. Every day people log in and write reviews, something that we had never seen people do before. And taking the lens of the consumer is first, and the community is first. And that was something, if you remember to the older days of like any of the previous generation of companies, it was always like the company paying was the first person on the list. So everything was 4.5 or 5 stars, right? In the city search days, right?
So you came in and pretty quickly you became, VP of engineering. Talk about how you used negotiation to persuade engineers to get stuff done. What were the either structural issues or persuasive processes you used to try to get as much out of you as you could out of the engineers?
One of my learnings from Google was that the best way to get, there's this magic of Google's environment where engineers are kind of left to work on what they want to work on. And you could see the passion that builds from that autonomy, the autonomy to be able to choose. And I felt it in myself. Like I was one of these engineers that was very motivated by being able to pick what I worked on. And so I wanted to preserve that. The flip side of Yelp is that Google had this fountain of money that was being created, right, every day. And so it had a lot of extra bandwidth. Yelp did not. It was in a constrained financial situation compared to like a Google situation. And so there wasn't like infinite cash to burn. And so that's where this idea for pragmatic Google kind of appeared, where it's like, hey, we're going to try to allow engineers to be able to, I wanted engineers to feel like they could select projects, but we have a constrained puzzle board, right? Like we have a constrained set of puzzle pieces and we need to like plug in the pieces of the puzzle. And so we're going to have to choose from different things on that puzzle board. I want an engineer to fire on the vector, like the direction and magnitude that they want to fire on. And as long as that vector was within 30 degrees of where the business is, like that was okay, right? And so that was always what I told every engineering manager, like limit that vector, like you limit the angle. But like if you have an engineer that's amazing, that's building incredible stuff, but they're like kind of off, they want to work on some open source thing for a little bit that like really doesn't like impact the business exactly where we want it, but like they're super motivated, like let them express that, right? Because you have to leave a little air for like, you might make mistakes too. You might not know that project is actually super valuable to Yelp in some other way. And that's what I saw at Google was like, sometimes I made a mistake in terms of like thinking that an infrastructure project was useless. When later, 2 years later, you see, oh, wow, like I didn't understand where this person's brain was going. It's something that you're negotiating with talent over. And it's also something where you have to see, is this engineer in terms of where they are in their career or where they are in their thinking? Like you have to make those judgment calls per engineer.
And so tactically, would you do one-on-one meetings? Would you do skip level meetings? How did you have these conversations about, how wide's the vector and, should you be kind of coming back a little bit to what we've asked you to do?
Yeah. So it iterated over time. It started off, I started off with every 2 weeks meeting up every engineer. So I was doing basically like 20 plus one-on-ones every 2 weeks. It's very difficult to do 22 one-on-ones every 2 weeks. It's just like, it's emotionally exhausting, right? Because you're listening to all this stuff from the organization, you're trying to fix it. Simultaneously, you're trying to hire, and it's just too much. So at that point, we installed our first layer of management. One smart thing that I did at the time was I promoted 4 different leaders. So we had like 4 people starting off in the same cohort that became managers. And so that was smart because then you had this cohort of people that were all at the same spot. Most of them had never managed before. And that allowed them to create this feeling of a team, right? So we had our first like kind of management team. And that was awesome because then I could coach everyone, and then we would have manager meetings, and we would all meet together. And I had this process of everyone sharing, and then that gave this group learning to the original group, and then I could see how they were growing.
Let's talk a little bit about the inevitable conflicts or relationship between engineers and the business folks, whether it's marketing, sales, product management. Startup that I worked at years ago, there were basically 2 camps. The engineers saw it this way: we make this stuff, the sales guys sell it. And if the buyers aren't buying, it's the sales guy's fault. And there would be a lot of conflict around who's got the vision for the product. The sales guys and the marketing guys really felt like, hey, we're touching the customer. We know what they want. The engineers would say, but we know what they should want. And we just had a lot of conflict. How did you structure the relationships between engineering and product? And what can we learn there from those negotiations?
Yeah, I'd say that I'd want to take the listeners to the very beginnings of Yelp. It was amazing to see we had a very small team. So it was like 6 of us, and 6 engineers. And there was this energy around we don't want engineers putting their having to they want to express their product sense on the designs from product, right? And the work that they had done. And so it was we want engineering to be able to de-steam their energy from being unhappy about how a product is designed, but really product has done their cycle, and it's not really for engineering to be oh, we don't like this, or this isn't social enough, or this isn't whatever. It's that's already been decided among the product team. They figured that out. And so we came up with kind of a launch strategy for okay, when we're launching when we're going to present a feature to engineering, we're going to do it as a kickoff meeting. And we're going to we're also going to have the PM kind of meet with each engineer, and they're going to be able to give their feedback of here's been the design, and then tell us if you have any tweaks to the feature that you really feel strongly about. And that way it kind of removes some of the steam from the engineering team in terms of being able to give feedback, but giving it in a private way rather than in one of these all hands settings where you're potentially wasting a lot of time. And so that was a strategy that we employed early on. It helped. We slowly graduated out of it over time. But I always have this concept of path of least bureaucracy, do the least amount of meetings to get the result that you want. And so that was a strategy that worked really effectively for Yelp engineering at the very beginning.
And did the PMs have ownership for product, or did engineering have ownership? How did you structure that?
PMs very much had the ownership of the product. And I think Yelp is kind of it's a very consumery product with a lot of art as much as science, and understanding the community and the interplay and especially the content creation piece and reading piece. There's kind of a whole brewing artistic understanding of that many people aren't fully cognizant of. It's similar to products like Craigslist, where it's I just sold my surfboard on Craigslist, and this thing has been around forever. And the UI is basically what it feels like it was when I started using it in 1998, right? Or 1999. And it's just the power of Yelp is in that bucket. It's this thing has been working for almost 20 years. And it's just, it's amazing. And so that understanding is very well held in the product team.
Okay, one of the things that I often talk to guests about is just how they manage difficult situations. I'm sure scaling that quickly. I mean, you got up to 500 engineers, and how long were you there? 10 years or so?
I was there for 10 years, yeah.
So going from 6 engineers to 510 years, that's just unbelievable, and it can't have all gone smoothly. Did you ever have any difficult employees where you had tough conversations with, you had to work things out through negotiation?
Yeah, I think, we had so we were in the middle of when the cloud was coming up. So Amazon had released S3, and then recently after that, they released EC2. And I was trying to move, we were on proprietary data centers, meaning we were racking and stacking machines and signing data center contracts ourselves. And we decided that we wanted to make an effort into moving into the cloud. And at the time, I was negotiating with a DevOps team that really was kind of recalcitrant in terms of wanting to move to the cloud. They didn't want to lose the control. They didn't believe Amazon was the right thing. And it was very controversial in the 2012, 2013 timeframe to move to Amazon. That was a controversial decision among DevOps teams at the time. So they built a service that then was really a proxy to 6 other services. So they only had to release one service.
Let me just make sure I understand that right. I think what you're saying is your DevOps team is essentially sabotaging things so that they hold control. Is that an oversimplification?
100%. And so that they were like a vice grip around the engineering team, choking the engineering productivity because they didn't want to go to AWS. They didn't want to release control. They wanted the process to stay the process. And that process was stuck at a 30-person size team process, and we were 100 engineers.
So it sounds like from a negotiation perspective, they're using a hammer here. You're the manager. How do you respond to the hammer?
At 100 engineer scale is a very different communication challenge than 30 engineers. And I decided, okay, in the all hands, I made a decision before the all hands that we were going to combine our DevOps and operations teams together. And I knew that I was in dangerous territory because like this DevOps team had like all control over databases and credit cards and all this stuff. And I knew by like combining these two teams, I was depowering the DevOps team, right? And they were going to see it as like their days were numbered. And so my negotiation with them was, hey, like I know that this doesn't feel great, and you guys are they were in the middle of launching this cross connect to AWS. So we were in the middle of connecting our proprietary data centers to AWS. And then we were building a second proprietary data center. So we were building our own data center, and I knew we needed a couple months to finish that project. So what I did was I offered both of the leads of this DevOps team. I offered them a bonus to stay on for a couple months and to help with the transition and turn on of this data center. So I gave them each a bonus to stay on. And so it was in that time that I wanted the information transfer to happen between this DevOps team and all the keys and all this stuff to the infrastructure team that could handle that. And the infrastructure team was largely just software engineers. They weren't operations people. And so it was a stretch, but like it ended up working and so like we ended up landing the ship. But I would say that was the most advanced brain surgery that we did on the Yelp organization when I was there, because it was just so delicate. The personalities involved were pretty difficult to manage through, and so it was definitely put a strain on everything. Right.
Let's talk a little bit about negotiation and compensation. It's my experience. So I learned the hard way that trying to overpay people to create loyalty and avoid churn doesn't necessarily work. That it's not always about compensation. You obviously in those years at Yelp we're competing with big companies like Google that are both going to pay more and be more stable. So was comp the issue really, or what did you offer people in negotiation mode to try to attract them away from the big companies?
Yeah. So what I used to really create a wedge around the developer experience being so much better than working at a large company. And so it was like, I was trying to market towards that engineer that's like mid-career that wants the feeling of a smaller team that you can actually put your arms around, but wants to work on challenging problems. And so that was kind of the thing we were always trying to hit. And one decision that I made that lasted for a long time was that I didn't want any engineering titles. So in most organizations, they do either private titles, so they'll have something like E1 through E7. And then the alternative of that is public titles. So like software engineer to like senior staff or principal level engineer. So you'll see different variations of this at every company in Silicon Valley. And I felt from my experience at Google when I joined, we actually had no titles. It was like basically a member of technical staff or software engineer, and that was it. And I felt that was the most productive time for me at Google, because then when I was meeting, I had a meeting with Rob Pike, who is the creator of Unix. Like, he's not judging, he's of course like a sage. Everyone knows that he's like a sage of engineering, but like when he's talking to me, it's like we're all at the same level. To me, that was a beautiful moment at Google. And so I wanted to preserve that for as long as we could at Yelp. And so we had no titles for, I think, 8 years. Till the last year, I held on to that. And then I was always struggling because I think Charlie Munger has that quote where it's like, show me the incentives and I'll show you the outcome, was the quote. And so I was always concerned with, if people are optimizing around title, like, you better be damn sure that the things you listed in your promotion thing are exactly what the organization needs. And I felt like I wanted to allow managers to be able to specify what the things that the organization needed and optimize for that, rather than some list that we have on some Notion or internal wiki page. and that are set in stone and that are really hard to change because you've introduced them to the organization and everyone's optimizing around that for comp and for their promotion and whatever. And so I always used to tell every manager, I was like, if someone's complaining about a title, I want to know, is it that they're not paid enough? I want to know, are they not excited about what they're working on? And do they really, are they really miserable with their team? The hard part is figuring out one of those three is the challenge with your report, right? Like, is it one of those things? And usually when you do the diagnosis of like, okay, is it comp? Is it what you're working on? Is it your control over your job? Like, is it the people on your team? Like, once you go through that checklist of all the things that potentially might be annoying the engineer, you find out what the answer is. And then it's like, oh, okay, like maybe we should do a team move. Maybe this is more aligned with like where you want to go. Or, hey, let's talk about the skills that you have that like aren't giving you the control on the team that you need, right? Or, oh, you want to lead a team. Like, let's talk about the skills associated with leading a team and like, let's get you there.
That's really good. So if I could summarize there, you'd say, rather than get stuck on a positional negotiation about what title, figure out what's driving the concern and address that issue. And so it's really getting behind the position at the interests.
Exactly.
And I found two things about negotiating over titles. One is people tend to do it, the more junior you are, the more you care about title. And then the more you're looking for the next job, the more you care about title. Was my experience. And one thing I always said to employees is, no one's hiring you based on your title. They're hiring you based on what you can do. And you get to frame in the interview what you can do. You have control over that. So it isn't as if someone looks on your LinkedIn and says, oh my gosh, he's a engineer 4, let's hire him. They're going to find out, right? And so I just think the junior folks focus way too much on title and they need to be coached, is my experience. I want to talk a little bit about your post-Yelp career doing angel investing, but just one final question on negotiating with engineers. Any other things that you found you frequently had to negotiate with engineers over? So we've talked a little bit about getting stuff done. We've talked a little about teams, product management, titles.
I think like a lot of engineers would want to negotiate over like where they were, what team they were on, or like whether they would be able to work on a specific thing from their undergrad or PhD and continue that on. And so I used to set expectations that like, hey, like that thing might not be, you might not be able to work on that thing immediately. And I think the most important thing is like really, really not having surprises for people. I used to describe an engineer joining the organization as an asteroid rotating around the Earth, right? So it's like you want to get that orbit, right? Because like in those first 3 days of the engineer joining, that orbit gets set, right? And so you want that orbit to be really, really nice and smooth. And if they join and it's like weird and like they feel like they got the rug pulled and they're not working on the thing that they want, they're going to be pissed. And then it just changes the whole energy around the employment.
So communicating super clearly and not baiting and switching an employee is really how I'd summarize that. Yeah. You and I talked about angel investing a bit. So let's just spend a couple minutes here on the end of that. Roughly how many investments have you made as an angel investor?
I made over 300 investments since I left Yelp.
So 300, I don't know very many people who aren't part of a fund that have made 300 angel investments. And so you've had a chance to listen to lots of entrepreneurs pitch you. What have you found, if you're going to kind of advise entrepreneurs who are going to pitch to angel investors, what's been most persuasive to you in terms of how they do it?
There's a Sequoia template for like pitching that I think is really a really good framing, which starts with like the problem that you're solving, the team, the TAM that you're going after, the why now. It just really frames like this setup out, and it doesn't need to be like I'd say like the stronger pitches today generally don't need the slide deck that much, but and definitely launching into a slide deck without having a need to do it is kind of painful. Like I definitely don't want to be in a pitch where it's just slide after slide after slide with you could do over a loom. I lose attention pretty fast. I want that to be a conversation, and then as you have the conversation, it's like, oh, my co-founder, let me bring up the slide. Here's the slide. We went to this and this and this school, and we worked at these companies. Pivoting the conversation back and forth between like a slide deck with materials and like your own stuff is a better way to go if you need the slides at all. It's just like the more conversational for like that first meeting, and like if it's not resonating with how you're telling the narrative, something about your pitch might be off.
That's helpful. In today's environment, AI is the new Google. I mean, if you look at companies like OpenAI and what they're paying people, it's probably hard for, even someone as big as Yelp to compete. So any lessons there that from your previous experience of competing for employees against Google that you'd say for companies today competing against OpenAI?
I think if you're competing in a foundational model level, that's very difficult. Most companies are not competing on a foundational model level. And for those companies, the route that I used to use was like, you play Moneyball. The market has its preconceived notion of like who an ultimate engineer is. And so you close your eyes and you imagine the ultimate LLM engineer. They won the Math Olympiad. They went to MIT. They did a postdoc with Andrew Ng at Stanford, right? Like that profile. It's like, let that one go. Like you don't need that. And so then the question is, okay, like where's the profile out of the bounds? Like in a quadrant that like no one might be looking. And so there was a program that we used to recruit from at Yelp for our search and ads teams called Insight. So they would take chemical engineers or analytical people that had done like like computational physics, and then they would put them through this Insights program. And then 6 weeks later, they'd have enough software engineering experience in the like professional software engineering sense to join a machine learning team or join in another organization. So a lot of if you went through the org tree of like a lot of the talent in the Yelp engineering land, a lot of this came from the data insights. A lot of the talent that ended up being leaders were from this data insights program. So I think trying to like open up a wide aperture and finding programs like a data insights or looking for talent outside of a normal, like people underestimate how fast people can learn. And so you give me an engineer from Jane Tree or whatever, where Sam Bankman-Fried was from. They have like some of the smartest engineers at like Jane Street, right? Take one of those engineers and like give them 3 months to learn LLM stuff. They're going to be as good as like someone who's been doing it for like a couple years that might not be as like, high bandwidth. So I just think that there's a lot of functional fixedness that happens in hiring where someone's like, I need 3 years of this and 2 years of that and whatever. And, as an engineering manager, you'll laugh because sometimes you'll see a technology like Rust. I would need an engineer with like 10 years of Rust. And it's like Rust only like started like 10 years ago, And so it's like, there's like 3 people that have that skill, right? So I'd be focused, if I was one of these companies that doing foundational stuff that didn't have a ton of money, I'd be focused on the new grads coming out, right? And so I'd be looking at masters and PhDs that are in their first or second year before they graduate, right?
That's super interesting. What would your advice be to an engineer who's trying to get a job that has a lot of requirements? Let's say they say you've got to have 3 years LLM, 3 years Rust, and you don't have that on your resume. How do you negotiate your way in? I mean, you told the story earlier of you negotiating your way into Google despite, not having the qualifications. So what would your advice be to students or young people that don't have the qualifications?
So like, I would go to these job fairs and freshmen would come up to me and they'd be like, what do I need to do to like get a job with your company? And I'd be like, hey, like, here's my email address. Send me a link to like some work that you did that you're really proud of that like shows me what you're capable of. And I think that goes a long way. So like one time I did that and an engineer sent me a Knuth. He did a JavaScript implementation of a Knuth CPU. And that was an outlier situation.
That's a pretty advanced thing for a young person to be doing.
Yeah, exactly. So, but like that got him the job. Yeah. But yeah, like that type of thing, I think like showing, what I showed at Google, what allowed me to transition was I showed my talent. And it was undeniable, right? And people were like, wow, this software tool that you built, no one else built it. And like, we need this talent in this organization. So I think I think when if you're not the greatest interviewer, I was never the greatest interviewee. And so I knew that, and I knew that was my weakness. And so I was always down for like working on an open source project or working on my own time, being able to like spend extra time to figure out something that I didn't know. And that would, by me applying myself, I could show you a lot more than I could show in an interview, like with a constrained algorithmic problem, right?
Excellent. Well, Michael Stoppelman, I think that's a great place to stop. It's been a great conversation. I really appreciate the generosity of your time.
Hey, thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for listening to All Things Negotiation. You can subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. If you enjoyed the show, please consider giving us a rating and leaving a review, which helps others find the show. The show was produced by Benny Beausoleil. Original music by Peter Breinhold. Designed by Aubrey Benson. Thanks for listening.